Imagine for a second that you are holding on to a promise.
Right.
But this is not just, a casual, everyday kind of guarantee. You are holding a massive, world-altering commitment. And it's going to take over 400 years to actually come true.
Which is just wild to wrap your head around.
It really is. And the catch here, like the terrifying reality of your situation, is that the absolute only way to ensure this promise survives at all, the only way to keep it from dying out completely, is to walk directly into the heart of a foreign, potentially hostile superpower.
Yeah, it completely forces a rewiring of how we think about survival. I mean, to save the promise, you basically have to pack up and leave the exact place you were promised.
Exactly. So welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking our really fascinating journey into a comprehensive theological framework today.
We really are.
We're pulling from this extensive essay and a series of visual infographics titled Preservation of the Covenant Family. And our mission today is to unpack the final chapters of the book of Genesis.
Right, specifically chapters 46 through 50.
Yeah, 46 through 50. But we are looking at this narrative through a very specific lens. I mean, this is not just the dramatic conclusion to the famous biography of Joseph, the coat of many colors and all that.
Yeah, it's so much bigger than that.
Right. We are looking at a sweeping blueprint for understanding divine providence, historical survival, and really the deeply intricate mechanics behind a 3,000-year-old promise.
Because, if you only read this as a family drama, you completely miss the underlying architecture. The framework we're analyzing today treats these chapters as the definitive thesis on how an ancient promise survives impossible odds.
Absolutely. Now, before we jump into the deep end, let's just set some ground rules for you, the listener. The texts, the historical claims, the infographics we're exploring today, they are deeply theological.
Yes, very much so.
They are firmly rooted in Christian doctrine and biblical exegesis. But our goal here is to act as your impartial guides through this material.
Right. We're just here to map it out.
Exactly. We are going to map out the fascinating arguments and philosophical concepts presented. The core assertion we are examining is this idea that God sovereignly preserves his people so that his redemptive purposes simply cannot fail.
Yeah.
We want to understand the how and the why of that claim, completely regardless of your personal background.
And the how is what makes this so incredibly compelling to analyze. I mean, it is entirely counterintuitive. The framework maps out a scenario where survival looks almost identical to defeat.
Right.
And where divine protection actually marches a family directly into what will become centuries of brutal slavery.
Yeah.
The argument presented here is that this isn't some, cosmic miscalculation or a flaw in the plan. It is the plan itself.
It is the plan. It's wild.
Right.
So let's start building this from the ground up with what the notes call the biblical foundations. Because to really grasp why this specific moment in ancient history is so terrifying for this family, we have to establish what is actually on the
You have to know the stakes.
Exactly. And the foundation goes back to initial promises made to a man named Abraham, well before the events of Genesis 46. We are talking about Genesis chapters 12 and 22 here. So, what are the specific guarantees made to Abraham in the text?
Well, they are three massive interconnected pillars, basically. First, there's the promise to make his descendants into a great nation.
Okay.
Second, to give those descendants a very specific physical territory, the land of Canaan. And third, the overarching guarantee that through his offspring, all the nations of the earth would eventually be blessed.
So nation, land, and global blessing.
Right. Nation, land, and global blessing.
Okay, so looking at the mechanics of those three pillars, it seems like the entire structure has a single fragile failure point. I mean, every single one of those promises absolutely requires descendants.
Oh, 100%.
Right, because without physical children, there is no nature. You cannot have a covenant community to inhabit a land if there is, well, no community.
And following the theological timeline provided in our materials, I mean, the stakes go much higher. Without the specific biological lineage continuing, there is no King David centuries later.
Oh, wow. Right.
And there is no Messiah. Therefore, the promised redemption for the rest of the world just evaporates. The entire architecture of this biblical narrative rests entirely on this one family having children who survive to have more children.
Which brings us to the crisis in Genesis chapter 46. There is a severe, devastating famine ravaging the ancient Near East.
And this isn't just, a tough economic quarter.
No, this is an extinction-level event for families without resources.
Yeah.
And that massive, world-altering promise, that global blessing, it is currently resting on the shoulders of exactly 70 people.
Just 70.
Yeah, the materials specifically highlight this headcount, 70 people.
Think about the margin for error there. It is practically non-existent. A single localized outbreak of disease, a few years of failed crops, or a raid by a neighboring tribe, and the lineage is erased.
It makes me think of like a modern startup company, but with the stakes dialed up to infinity.
Well, I like that.
Imagine you founded a startup, right? And you are down to your absolute last $100 in the operating account. You hold a brilliant, ironclad business plan that guarantees, mathematically ensures you are going to become a global empire that changes humanity.
Right.
But today, in the physical reality of the present moment, you cannot even afford to keep the lights on in your rented garage. That is Jacob's family. They are holding a promise of global proportions, but they are staring at imminent starvation.
Yeah, the tension there is profound. The framework we are studying insists that this narrative is not just a quaint historical record of a family finding food.
Right, it's so much more.
It is documenting a deliberate, desperate act of preservation. The famine is threatening the entire region equally. But the focus here is on preserving this specific vehicle through which a larger salvation is supposed to enter human history.
But to survive this famine, I mean, they have to make a choice that seems to violently contradict the very promise they're trying to protect. They have to leave the promised land.
Which is terrifying.
Yeah, Jacob's journey into Egypt is described as a moment of absolute terror for him. And frankly, looking at the geography and the history, his fear is completely justified. He's being asked to turn his back on Canaan, the literal dirt that was guaranteed to his grandfather Abraham.
Yeah, put yourself in his sandals for a second. You are holding the deed to this territory. It defines your entire identity.
Right.
If you pack up your tents and walk away, haven't you abandoned the covenant? The theological crisis here is monumental. Jacob actually stops the migration at a place called Beersheba, which is right on the southern border of Canaan.
The last stop.
Exactly. It is the absolute last outpost before you hit the desert wilderness leading to Egypt.
And he stalls.
And it is at that border town, staring into the desert, that he has a night vision. The text quotes a divine message. Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt. I myself will go down with you and bring you up again. We need to pause and look at the radical theological shift happening in that single sentence. Because in the ancient Near Eastern mindset, religions were deeply, intensely localized.
Right, like regional managers.
Yeah, exactly. Deities were fundamentally tied to specific mountains, specific rivers, or specific geopolitical borders. If you left a god's territory, you left their jurisdiction. You left their protection.
You essentially walked off the map of their power.
Yes. So for the God of Abraham to declare, I myself will go down with you into Egypt, he is shattering the entire ancient paradigm of how the divine operates. He is declaring that his presence, and therefore his power, is not limited by geography or national borders.
So the covenant isn't bound to the dirt.
No, he's carried by the presence of God accompanying his people. The materials we were reviewing point out how this specific moment at Beersheba lays the groundwork for massive concepts much later in the biblical timeline.
Oh, like what?
Well, it creates the precedent for God's presence remaining with the Israelites centuries later when they are dragged into the Babylonian exile. It points directly toward the New Testament, to Christ's promise in Matthew 28 to be with his followers always, even to the end of the age. It establishes the foundation for a global church that can live among any nation in any culture.
Wow, okay. But I have to challenge the overarching strategy here, though. From a purely logical perspective, why does this grand plan involve abandoning the promised land at all?
That's a fair question.
If the premise is an all-powerful deity, why not just make it rain in Canaan? Why not supernaturally sustain their crops right where they are? Marching a vulnerable 70-person family into Egypt, which was the dominant pagan military superpower of the ancient world, feels like throwing a lamb into a lion's den. I mean, it seems reckless.
It does seem reckless if you view permanence as the ultimate goal for them in that moment. The framework addresses this by distinguishing between temporary provision and permanent inheritance. The argument is that Egypt was strictly a temporary incubator. Because remember, the vision at Beersheba explicitly included the promise, I will also bring you up again.
So the exit strategy is announced before they even cross the border.
Exactly. The exit strategy is woven into the entry. The theological extrapolation the author makes here is that believers in this tradition are fundamentally designed to live as pilgrims.
Pilgrims.
Yeah. There are references to the book of Hebrews, which speaks of living as strangers and exiles on the earth. The concept is that every earthly security, even a desperately needed refuge like the Egyptian grain supply during a famine, is temporary. The text posits that protection often happens through displacement.
Wow. Through displacement.
Right. It forces the realization that ultimate security isn't found in a specific location or a stable geopolitical climate, but in the divine relationship itself.
That's a huge perspective shift. Let's follow them across that border, though. They make the move. But the moment they arrive, they face an immediate, massive sociological threat. I mean, you take 70 nomadic shepherds and drop them into the most advanced, culturally overwhelming civilization on the planet.
It's a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. How do they not just vanish? How do you prevent them from assimilating, intermarrying, adopting the local customs and gods, and completely dissolving into the fabric of Egyptian society over the next few generations?
The sociology of this migration is fascinating, and this is where the strategic geography of their settlement comes into play.
Right.
The text focuses on Genesis chapter 47. Joseph, who has miraculously risen to become essentially the prime minister of Egypt, does not move his family into the capital city.
Which you'd think he would, right, to give them the royal treatment.
Exactly. You would think he'd want them close. But no, he settles them in a very specific, isolated region called the land of Goshen.
And the visual infographics we have spent a lot of time on this. They dedicate an entire section to breaking down why Goshen. What is the actual strategic value of this specific piece of real estate in the Nile Delta?
Well, Goshen provided a convergence of several critical factors. First, it was incredibly fertile pasture land. Jacob's family were shepherds, so this provided immediate economic stability and food security for their livestock.
Right. They needed that to survive.
Second, it offered vast physical space. Remember, those 70 people are mandated by the promise to become a great nation. They needed room for explosive population growth.
You can't do that in a cramped city block.
No, you can't. But the most vital feature, from a theological and sociological standpoint, was its separation from the Egyptian cultural centers.
The phrase used in the notes that really stuck out to me is, separation supports holiness.
It is a core principle in this framework. If this family had been integrated into the heart of Memphis or Thebes, participating in the daily civic and religious life of the Egyptian metropolis, their unique covenant identity would have been eroded within a century.
They would have just become Egyptians.
It's exactly. Goshen acted as a geographical and cultural buffer zone. It allowed them to survive the regional famine by tapping into Egypt's massive resources, while simultaneously maintaining their distinct cultural and religious boundaries.
Think about it like a cultural greenhouse.
Oh, I like that.
Right. If you have a fragile, rare, exotic plant, which in this narrative is a 70-person family carrying a fragile global promise, and you plant it outside in the harsh winter of a dominant foreign culture, it freezes and dies.
Yeah.
Alternatively, if you just lock it in a dark, impenetrable safe to protect it, it starves of light and can't grow. A greenhouse is the perfect middle ground. It provides a climate-controlled environment. It lets the sunlight and the nutrients in, but it provides a physical barrier against the elements that would destroy the plant.
It's spot on.
Goshen was this perfectly engineered greenhouse. It allowed this family to safely explode in population, growing from 70 individuals into the millions that eventually march out of Egypt centuries later in the Book of Exodus.
The greenhouse imagery captures it perfectly. The source material draws a very deliberate line from this ancient settlement strategy in Goshen to much later New Testament theology.
How so?
Well, Goshen becomes the prototype for the biblical mandate to remain distinct but not completely isolated. It prefigures the concept found in the Gospel of John, where followers are asked to be in the world but not of the world.
Ah, I see.
It also links to the Apostle Peter's later writings, calling for a lifestyle of holiness. The framework defines this type of holiness as a faithful distinction, engaging with the surrounding world for survival and purpose, without absorbing its fundamental worldview.
But, I mean, establishing this perfectly engineered greenhouse in prime Egyptian real estate didn't happen by accident. You don't just wander into a foreign empire and claim the best pasture land.
No, you definitely don't.
It required an insider with staggering political leverage to authorize it. And that brings us to Joseph. And discussing Joseph brings us face to face with a profound, often uncomfortable paradox regarding human suffering and trauma.
We have to examine Joseph's trajectory here, because he is the literal mechanism making this entire preservation strategy possible. And his path to the palace was defined by brutal, repeated trauma.
The notes dive deep into the theology of Joseph's suffering. We are looking at Genesis 45. Joseph finally reveals his identity to the older brothers who, years earlier, had violently assaulted him and sold him into human trafficking.
Such a heavy moment.
Incredibly heavy. And in that moment of revelation, he says something staggering to them. He says, God sent me before you to preserve life. And he repeats the idea, saying it was to preserve for you a remnant on earth.
The textual analysis here focuses heavily on the original language, specifically the Hebrew verb translated as preserve. The word is aya.
Let's unpack the weight of that specific word. Why does the author highlight aya?
It carries a very active, forceful connotation. Aya emphasizes the deliberate act of sustaining life in the direct face of imminent death. It is about keeping something alive that by all natural laws should perish. The framework argues that Joseph was not elevated to his position simply to implement brilliant agricultural policies or to save the Egyptian economy, even though he accomplished that.
Right, that was a byproduct.
Exactly. Through this theological lens, he was thrust into power specifically to save the covenant family. His entire administration of the grain during the global crisis was a direct instrument of divine providence executing the ancient promise.
The material expands this concept to identify a broader, recurring pattern throughout biblical history, actually. The text argues that divine providence continually utilizes unexpected and often explicitly pagan rulers and empires to accomplish its goals.
Yeah, the infographics list a fascinating sequence of this.
Right. It starts with Pharaoh here in Genesis, but later includes King Cyrus of Persia, who allows the Jews to return from exile, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who is used as an instrument of judgment, and even Caesar Augustus in the New Testament, whose census decree sets the stage for the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem.
The overarching principle derived from this pattern is that human governments and massive geopolitical movements, often completely unknowingly, serve as scaffolding for divine purposes.
Scaffolding. That's a great word for it.
Right. The framework makes a bold statement here. Human sin does not defeat God's plan. We see the absolute pinnacle of this philosophical concept in Genesis 50:20. This is the moment after their father Jacob has died, and Joseph's brothers are terrified he will finally take his revenge.
Which, I mean, you can't blame them for thinking that.
No, not at all. But Joseph looks at them and says, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good."
It is one of the most famous verses in the text, but when you strip away the familiarity and really analyze it, it forces a deeply uncomfortable question.
It really does.
If the framework claims that providence is directing all of history, if it is utilizing the oppressive mechanics of foreign empires, and utilizing the vicious jealousy of brothers who sell their own sibling into slavery, does this narrative suggest that human free will doesn't actually matter?
That is the big question, yeah.
Are humans just, unthinking pawns being moved around a cosmic chessboard? It almost sounds like the text implies human suffering and trauma are just tools being wielded for a larger agenda.
It is the most critical philosophical tension in the entire narrative.
Yeah.
The materials are very careful to thread the needle here regarding compatibilism.
Okay, break that down for us.
The framework explicitly clarifies that the text is not arguing that divine providence approves of or authors the sin. The brothers' intentions were genuinely malicious, the trauma Joseph endured was horrifically real, and the humans involved remained fully morally accountable for their actions.
Right.
When Joseph says, "You meant evil against me," he is validating the absolute reality of their cruelty and his own suffering.
So the divine is not pulling the strings of the brothers' jealousy. The evil is entirely human.
That is the core distinction. But the second half of the statement, "but God meant it for good," reveals the scope of the framework's view of providence. It suggests a power so infinitely complex that it can take genuine human evil, deep conflict, and years of painful injustice and weave them into a flawless redemptive outcome.
It doesn't just undo it, it weaves it in.
Exactly. The argument is that providence does not simply react to human history, scrambling to clean up the messes we make. It actively redirects the momentum of those messes toward an ultimate good.
The infographic summarizes it with a really striking phrase, actually. God often works in the prison before the palace.
It highlights the concept of preparatory suffering. The framework argues that seasons of intense hardship, delay, and testing are frequently the exact environments used to forge the character required for greater purposes.
Right, because Joseph wasn't ready before.
No, he wasn't. Joseph had to endure the betrayal of the pit, the false accusations in Potiphar's house, and the despair of the Egyptian prison to be shaped into a leader capable of saving his family without destroying them in vengeance. The suffering, while genuinely painful and unjustly inflicted, was ultimately repurposed into preparation.
We see this incredible subversion of expectations, this recurring theme that true power operates completely contrary to human power structures, reach a fascinating climax in a specific, easily overlooked room in Genesis chapter 47. It is a moment where the accepted power dynamics of the ancient world are completely inverted.
You're looking at the formal meeting between Jacob and Pharaoh.
Genesis 47, verses 7 through 10. The aging patriarch, Jacob, who has just arrived as a refugee, is brought into the royal court to meet Pharaoh, and the interaction is stunning. Jacob blesses Pharaoh.
The author highlights this as a quiet, yet utterly revolutionary scene. To understand the gravity, you have to consider who these two individuals represent in the eyes of the ancient world.
Let's paint that visual contrast, set the scene in that throne room for us.
Well, on one side of the room, you have Pharaoh. He is the absolute monarch of the most technologically advanced, wealthy, and militarily dominant civilization on the face of the earth.
Right.
In the Egyptian cultural worldview, he isn't merely a king. He's revered as a living incarnation of the divine. He single-handedly controls the food supply that is keeping the known world alive during the famine. He is the ultimate symbol of human achievement and power.
And walking toward him across the floor of that throne room.
You have Jacob. He is a frail, aged refugee fleeing starvation. He is a nomadic shepherd, an occupation that the text explicitly notes earlier was culturally loathsome to the Egyptians.
Yeah, they hated shepherds.
Exactly. He owns no land he can currently live on, he commands no army, and he is walking into this opulent palace to essentially beg for rations to keep his tiny family from dying out.
This dusty, exhausted refugee walks into the absolute epicenter of ancient geopolitical power, stands before a man worshipped as a living god. And what does he do? He assumes the position of the spiritual superior.
It's incredible.
He doesn't just express gratitude for the grain, he blesses the monarch.
In the ancient biblical framework, the dynamic of blessing is rigidly structured.
Yeah.
The lesser is always blessed by the greater.
Right.
By extending a blessing to Pharaoh, Jacob is quietly but definitively asserting spiritual authority over the most powerful political figure on earth.
What are the broader implications of that moment, according to the framework?
The materials point out that this brief interaction is actually the initial, tangible fulfillment of Abraham's original calling. Go back to that third pillar of the promise.
Yeah.
In your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed.
Oh, wow.
Here, in the Grand Court of Egypt, massive political and economic power is shown, bowing before covenant grace. The author argues this scene vividly demonstrates how the kingdom of God advances within this theological worldview.
So it's not through force.
No, it does not advance through military conquest, geographic dominance, or economic leverage. It advances through divine blessing. The assertion is that the true lasting power in that throne room wasn't the man sitting on the gold chair. It was the frail shepherd carrying the invisible promise.
The visual irony is incredible. But, despite the soaring theological high point in the throne room, reality quickly crashes back down. Jacob is an extremely old man. His health is failing. He is going to die in this foreign land, miles away from Canaan.
Yeah.
And this introduces a massive existential crisis for the covenant itself. How does the promise survive the actual physical death of the patriarchs? I mean, if the individual who holds the promise dies in a foreign country, doesn't the promise essentially expire with him?
That anxiety leads directly into what the framework calls the long game, or the mechanics of generational providence.
The long game.
Yeah. The text directs our attention to Genesis 47, verses 29 through 31. Jacob realizes his death is imminent. He calls Joseph in and makes him swear a solemn binding oath. He says, "Do not bury me in Egypt." He forcefully demands that his bones be carried all the way back to Canaan.
And then we see history repeat itself at the very end of the book. In Genesis 50, Joseph is now the one on his deathbed. He gathers his relatives and says, God will surely visit you and bring you up out of this land.
Right.
And he makes them swear an identical oath, demanding they take his bones with them when the Exodus finally happens.
The source material focuses heavily on these seemingly macabre requests regarding their bones because they illustrate a foundational theological principle. Providence operates across generations.
Okay, unpack that.
Consider the track record of these founding fathers. Abraham had massive failures of faith. Isaac was deeply flawed. Jacob spent most of his life as a manipulative deceiver. Joseph endured unimaginable suffering and assimilation into Egyptian politics.
Right, none of them were perfect.
Exactly. And critically, not a single one of these men lived to see the Exodus or the actual fulfillment of the territorial promises.
They all died holding uncashed checks. They had the promise, but they never saw the funds clear the bank.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize it. Yet the framework notes that the covenant endured anyway. Why? Because the entire system rests on the faithfulness of the divine, not on the moral perfection or the limited lifespans of the humans involved.
That takes the pressure off the individual.
It really does. The text offers a beautiful piece of imagery here, describing Joseph's coffin resting in Egypt as a silent witness to covenant hope. For hundreds of years, as new generations of Israelites were born into what eventually became brutal slavery, that unburied coffin sat there.
Just waiting.
It was a tangible, physical monument preaching future redemption. It was a constant reminder that their current reality in Egypt was not their final destination.
Eventually, centuries later in Exodus chapter 13, Moses actually fulfills that oath, carrying Joseph's bones out of Egypt. But considering this from our modern perspective, this concept of vast generational delay is deeply frustrating to the human psyche.
Oh, absolutely. We hate waiting.
We are intensely wired for immediate results. We want the problem solved today. How does an individual sustain belief in a promise when the delay stretches not just for a few tough years, but for centuries of silence and eventual enslavement?
It represents the ultimate test of endurance within this belief system.
Yeah.
The materials address this modern frustration directly by warning against a very specific, dangerous misunderstanding. Assuming delay means abandonment.
Which is so easy to do.
It's our default setting. The framework argues that divine timing consistently operates on a scale that shatters human expectations. The people in this narrative had to learn to embrace promises whose fulfillment only their great-great-grandchildren would ever witness.
That requires so much vision.
It does. The text contends that faith, in its most robust biblical form, often requires participating faithfully in a massive story where you will absolutely not see the conclusion in your own lifetime.
That is a remarkably difficult concept to internalize. But it is precisely this idea, a promise stretching across vast expanses of time, that allows the framework to connect this ancient story about a regional famine in Genesis to the entire overarching span of the Bible.
This is where the scope of the material expands dramatically.
Yeah.
The provided infographics don't just view Genesis 6 through 50 as an isolated historical anecdote.
Right.
They map this specific story onto a massive 12-part timeline labeled God's Grand Narrative.
I want to spend some time exploring this timeline because it fundamentally changes the scale of what we're talking about. It takes the story of 70 people in a tent and stretches it from before the universe existed all the way to the end of time.
It is a sweeping architectural view of history. The framework groups these 12 stages to show a continuous thread of providence. If we look at the first block of stages, eternity, creation, and the fall, the text argues that before creation even occurred, there was an eternal decree to redeem a people.
Okay.
Creation set the stage for humanity to multiply, which we see echoed in the mandate for those 70 people to become a great nation. The fall introduces the brokenness, the famine, the jealousy, the human trafficking. But the framework insists the fall cannot overturn the original eternal decree.
That leads right into the next block, covenant, redemption, and kingdom. The entire migration of Jacob's family into Egypt is categorized under covenant. It is a desperate rescue mission to safeguard the lineage.
And that preservation in Goshen directly prepares the stage for redemption. The framework identifies the future exodus from Egypt as the Old Testament's central defining act of redemption.
Right.
It serves as the physical prototype for the ultimate spiritual salvation that comes later. Following that redemption, they eventually establish the kingdom under David, achieving the territorial and national promises made to Abraham.
But the kingdom stage crumbles, leading to a cycle of exile and restoration. And here's where I see a massive warning light flashing for anyone trying to apply this framework to their own life.
What do you mean?
When we look at this cycle of preservation, exile, and restoration, the notes highlight a common, very dangerous misunderstanding: the tendency to equate preservation with comfort.
It is arguably the most vital distinction in the entire text. Human nature dictates that if a divine power is actively protecting us, it should feel safe. It should feel like a hammock.
Right, we want the hammock.
We desperately want preservation to mean a life completely free of stress, financial collapse, or interpersonal conflict. But the framework asserts something much harder, much more abrasive. God preserves his people through suffering, not necessarily from suffering.
We see that perfectly in the geography of Goshen. It was a refuge from the famine, yes. It provided food and space. But fast forward a few generations, and that exact same piece of real estate becomes the site of brutal, systemic enslavement.
Yeah.
The sanctuary of one generation literally morphed into the furnace of the next.
Because the preservation was about protecting the purpose, the lineage, and the promise, it was not a guarantee of physical comfort. The framework is warning the reader that divine protection today does not exempt you from severe trials tomorrow. In fact, the sanctuary might just be preparing you to survive the furnace.
As we continue down the grand timeline, we hit the stages of the Messiah and the Church. And this reveals another major misunderstanding the text warns about: missing the Christological fulfillment.
This is the crux of the author's argument regarding the New Testament connection. If you read the story of Joseph and the famine, and your only takeaway is a moral lesson like, I need to learn to forgive my siblings just like Joseph did, you have completely missed the architecture.
You missed the whole point.
Right. The framework argues that the preservation of Israel is never an end in itself. The genealogical line from Abraham down through the centuries remains intact solely because God faithfully guarded this specific family in Goshen. The entire story points entirely forward to Jesus, the ultimate Savior through whom the global blessing promised to Abraham is finally realized.
Which brings us to the church stage, where the framework argues that modern believers inherit these promises. But that introduces a third misunderstanding: neglecting holiness while seeking security.
We can tie this directly back to the greenhouse of Goshen. The family wasn't placed in Goshen just to physically survive the famine. They were placed there to remain distinct from the surrounding culture.
Right.
The author issues a sharp warning here. Seeking physical, social, or economic security at the direct expense of your foundational values or identity is never the goal. If you assimilate to survive, you lose the very identity you were trying to preserve.
The timeline concludes with judgment, the millennium, and finally, new creation. The narrative that started with a desperate attempt to keep 70 starving people alive ultimately culminates in the gathering of an innumerable redeemed multitude from every nation into a new heavens and new earth.
It's an amazing trajectory.
The God who hyper-focused on preserving one tiny family ends up preserving an eternal multitude.
It is a breathtaking scope. It frames human history not as a series of chaotic, random accidents, but as a deeply directed narrative where even the darkest centuries of delay serve a brilliant, ultimately redemptive purpose.
All of this brings us to the crucial application. We have covered a massive amount of theological ground, traversing thousands of years of ancient history and philosophy. What can you, the listener, actually pull from an ancient text about a family migrating during a regional famine and apply to your life on a Tuesday morning?
Well, the materials synthesize all this deep theology into several highly practical implications. First, it challenges us to trust hidden providence.
Hidden providence.
Right. The vast majority of this preserving work was completely invisible to the people experiencing it. You are encouraged to trust that there's an unseen architecture at work, even when your immediate circumstances seem utterly chaotic or completely contrary to what you hoped for.
Second, it demands that we think generationally. This is a massive challenge to our modern, hyper-individualized mindset. It asks us to look far beyond our own lifespan.
Yeah, it's so hard to do.
It is. Are you investing your time, your resources, and your values into communities and families that will continue to bear fruit long after you are gone? Are you willing to hold a promise that you might not see fulfilled?
Third, it calls for living as a pilgrim. The framework uses the Apostle Paul's words in Philippians to remind believers that their ultimate citizenship is not tied to any current geopolitical system. The practical takeaway is to use the blessings and the resources of this world, your own personal Goshen, wisely and gratefully, but never treat them as your permanent, final home.
Fourth, you must fiercely preserve your identity. Just as that ancient family had to remain culturally distinct to survive in Egypt, the challenge today is to remain faithful to your core convictions, regardless of the corporate environment, the social pressure, or the cultural moment you find yourself immersed in. Assimilation is the death of purpose.
And finally, there is a call to rest in faithfulness. The ultimate survival of that ancient promise did not depend on Jacob suddenly becoming a flawless human being. It depended entirely on the steadfastness of the divine. The framework offers this as a profound source of peace during seasons of intense uncertainty or personal failure.
So we circle all the way back to where we began. What appears on the dusty surface of the text to be a simple, desperate migration of 70 starving people looking for grain, is actually revealed to be a decisive, sovereign act that safeguarded the entire unfolding drama of human history.
That's beautiful, really.
It was a 400-year promise walking directly into the jaws of a hostile superpower, protected by a providence that redirects human malice and geopolitical chaos to accomplish an ultimate good.
The overarching thesis is undeniable. History is directed, and even the most agonizing delays are heavy with purpose.
And that leaves us with a final thought for you to carry into your week. We've spent a lot of time today dissecting the concepts of hidden providence and agonizing generational delay. I want you to take a hard look at the current delays, the seemingly pointless hardships, or the deep feelings of displacement you might be experiencing in your own life right now.
We all have them.
We all have those seasons where we feel sidelined, forgotten, or stuck in a waiting room. But consider the framework we just explored. What if those deeply uncomfortable waiting periods aren't a mistake? What if they aren't a deviation from your story at all? What if they are actually the exact Goshen being deliberately used to incubate you, to protect you from dangers you don't even know exist, and to forge you for a future that is vastly more important than anything you can currently see?